Hello. If you are watching this video, first off, welcome to the new chapters. I'm giving you some new stuff to listen to because you're probably bored of the other one. I'm gonna do my best to read as much as I can. I'm sorry I can't read to you right now, like in person. In person at all. Alright, I'm yapping. Shut up. I miss you. And I love you so much. I can't wait to talk to you. Good night, baby. We're still in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. We're at chapter 16, the Goblet of Fire. I don't believe it, Ron said in a stern voice as the Hogwarts students filed back up the steps behind the party from Durmstrang. Crumb, Harry. Victor Crumb. For heaven's sake, Ron, he's only a Quidditch player, said Hermione. Only a Quidditch player, Ron said, looking at her as though he couldn't believe his ears. Hermione is one of the best seekers in the world. I had no idea he was still in school. As they crossed the entrance hall with the rest of the Hogwarts students heading for the Great Hall, Harry saw Lee Jordan jumping up and down on the soles of his feet to get a better look at the back of Crumb's head. Several sixth years were frantically searching their pockets as they walked. I don't believe it. I haven't got a single quill on me. Do you think he'd sign my hat and lipstick? Really, Hermione said loftily as they passed the girls, now squabbling over the lipstick. I'm getting his autograph if I can, said Ron. You haven't got a quill, have you, Harry? Nope, they're upstairs in my bag, said Harry. They walked over to the Gryffindor table and sat down. Ron took care to sit on the side facing the doorway because Crumb and his fellow Durmstrang students were still gathered around it, apparently unsure about where they should sit. The students from Beauxbatons had chosen seats at the Ravenclaw table. They were looking around the great hall with glum expressions on their faces. 3 of them were still clutching scarves and shawls around their heads. It's not that cold, Hermione said defensively. Why didn't they bring cloaks? Over here. Come and sit here, Ron hissed. Over here. Hermione, budge up. Make space. What? Too late, said Ron bitterly. Victor Crumb and his fellow Durmstrang students had settled themselves at the Slytherin table. Harry could see Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle looking very smug about this. As he watched, Malfoy bent forward to speak to Crumb. Yeah, that's right. Swarm up to him, Malfoy, said Ron. Scat, whatever. I bet Crumb can see right through him, though. But he gets people fawning over him all the time. Where do you reckon they're going to sleep? We could offer him a space in our dormitory, Harry. I wouldn't mind giving him my bed. I could keep on a camp bed. Hermione snorted. They look a lot happier than the Beauxbatons lot, said Harry. The Durmstrang students were pulling off their heavy furs and looking up at the starry black ceiling with expressions of interest. A couple of them were picking up the golden plates and goblets and examining them, apparently impressed. Up at the staff table, Filch, the caretaker, was adding chairs. He was wearing his moldy old tailcoat in honor of the occasion. Harry was surprised to see that he added 4 chairs, 2 on either side of Dumbledore's. But there are only 2 extra people, Harry said. Why is Filch putting out 4 chairs? Who else is coming? Ah, said Ron vaguely. He was still staring avidly at Crumb. When all the students had entered the hall and settled down at their house tables, the staff entered, filing up to the top table and taking their seats. Last in line were Professor Dumbledore, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxime. When their headmistress appeared, the pupils from Beauxbatons slipped to their feet. A few of the Hogwarts students laughed. The Beauxbatons party appeared quite unembarrassed, however, and did not resume their seats until Madame Maxine had sat down on Dumbledore's left-hand side. Dumbledore remained standing, and a silence fell over the great hall. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ghosts and, most particularly, guests," said Dumbledore, beaming around at the foreign students. "I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to Hogwarts. I hope and trust that your stay here will be both comfortable and enjoyable." One of the Beauxbatons girls, still clutching a muffler around her head, gave what was unmistakably a derisive laugh. "No one's making you stay," Hermione whispered, bristling at her. "The tournament will be officially open at the end of the feast," said Dumbledore. "I now invite you all to eat, drink, and make yourselves at home." He sat down, and Harry saw Karkaroff lean forward at once and engage him in conversation. The plates in front of them filled with food as usual. The house elves in the kitchen seemed to have pulled out all the stops. There was a greater variety of dishes in front of them than Harry had ever seen, including several that were definitely foreign. "What's that?" said Ron, pointing at a large dish of some sort of shellfish that stood beside a large steak and kidney pudding. "Bouillabaisse," said Hermione. "Bless you," said Ron. "It's French," said Hermione. "I had it on holiday summer before last. It's very nice." "I'll take your word for it," said Ron, helping himself to black pudding. The great hall seemed somehow much more crowded than usual, even though there were barely 20 additional students there. Perhaps it was because their differently colored uniforms stood out so clearly against the black of the Hogwarts robes. Now that they had removed their furs, the Durmstrang students were revealed to be wearing robes of a deep blood red. Hagrid settled into the hall through a door behind the staff table. 20 minutes after the start of the feast, he slid into a seat at the end and waved at Harry, Ron, and Hermione with a very heavily bandaged hand. "Scrooge doing all right, Hagrid?" Harry called. "Thriving," Hagrid called back happily. "Yeah, I'll just bet they are," said Ron quietly. "Looks like they found a food they like, doesn't it? Hagrid's fingers." At that moment, a voice said, "Excuse me, are you wanting some bouillabaisse?" It was the girl from Beauxbatons who had laughed during Dumbledore's speech. She had finally removed her muffler. A long sheet of silvery blonde hair fell almost to her waist. She had large, deep blue eyes and very white, even teeth. Ron went purple, stared up at her, opened his mouth to reply, but nothing came out except for a faint gurgling noise. "Yeah, have it," said Harry, pushing the dish toward the girl. "You have finished with it?" "Yeah," said Ron breathlessly. "Yeah, it was excellent." The girl picked up the dish and carried it carefully off to the Ravenclaw table. Ron was still goggling at the girl as though he had never seen one before. Harry started to laugh. The sound seemed to jog Ron back to his senses. "She's a Veela," he said hoarsely to Harry. "Of course she isn't," said Hermione tartly. "I don't see anyone else gaping at her like an idiot." But she wasn't entirely right about that. As the girl crossed the hall, many boys' heads turned, and some of them seemed to have become temporarily speechless, just like Ron. "I'm telling you, that's not a normal girl," said Ron, leaning sideways so he could keep a clear view of her. "They don't make them like that at Hogwarts." "They make them okay at Hogwarts," said Harry without thinking. Joe happened to be sitting only a few places away from the girl with the silvery hair. "When you've both put your eyes back in," said Hermione briskly, "you'll be able to see who's just arrived." She was pointing up at the staff table. 2 remaining empty seats had just been filled. Ludo Bagman was now sitting on Professor Karkaroff's other side, while Mr. Crouch, Percy's boss, was next to Madame Maxime. "What are they doing here?" said Harry in surprise. "They organized the Triwizard Tournament, didn't they?" said Hermione. "I suppose they wanted to be here to see you start." When the second course arrived, they noticed a number of unfamiliar desserts too. Ron examined an odd sort of pale, I don't even know, closely, then moved it carefully a few inches to his right so that it would be clearly visible from the Ravenclaw table. The girl who looked like Ophelia appeared to have eaten enough, however, and did not come over to get it. Once the golden plates had been wiped clean, Dumbledore stood up again. A pleasant sort of tension seemed to fill the hall now. Harry felt a slight thrill of excitement, wondering what was coming. Several feet down from them, Fred and George were leaning forward, staring at Dumbledore with great concentration. "The moment has come," said Dumbledore, smiling around at a sea of upturned faces. "The Triwizard Tournament is about to start. I would like to say a few words of explanation before we bring in the casket." "The what?" Harry muttered. Ron shrugged. "Just to clarify the procedure that we will be following this year. But first, let me introduce, for those who do not know them, Mr. Bartimus Crouch, the head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation." There was a smattering of polite applause. "I don't know what I just said," I stroked out. "Mr. Ludo Bagman, head of Department of Magical Games and Sports." There was a much louder round of applause for Bagman than for Crouch, perhaps because of his fame as beater, or simply because he looked so much more likable. He acknowledged it with a jovial wave of his hand. Bartimus Crouch did not smile or wave when his name was announced. Remembering him in his neat suit at the Quidditch World Cup, Harry thought he looked strange in wizard robes. His toothbrush mustache and severe parting, looked very odd next to Dumbledore's long white hair and beard. "Mr. Bagman and Mr. Crouch have worked tirelessly over the last few months on the arrangement for the Triwizard Tournament," Dumbledore continued, "and they will be joining myself, Professor Karkaroff, and Madame Maxime on the panel that will judge the champions' efforts." At the mention of the word champions, the attentiveness of listening students seemed to sharpen. Perhaps Dumbledore had noticed their sudden stillness, for he smiled as he said, "The casket, then, if you please, Mr. Filch." Filch, who had been lurking unnoticed in a far corner of the hall, now approached Dumbledore, carrying a great wooden chest encrusted with jewels. It looked extremely old. A murmur of excited interest rose from the watching students. Dennis Creevey actually stood on his chair to see it properly, but being so tiny, his head hardly rose above anyone else's. "The instructions for the task the champions will face this year have already been examined by Mr. Crouch and Mr. Bagman," said Dumbledore as Filch placed the chest carefully on the table before him. "And they have made the necessary arrangements for each challenge. There will be 3 tasks, spaced throughout the school year, and they will test the champions in many different ways. Their magical powers, their daring, their powers of deduction, and of course, their ability to cope with danger." At this last word, the hall was filled with silence, so absolutely that nobody seemed to be breathing. "As you know, 3 champions will compete in the tournament," Dumbledore went on calmly. "One for each of the participating schools. They will be marked on how well they perform each of the tournament tasks, and the champion with the highest total after Task 3 will win the Triwizard Cup. The champions will be chosen by an impartial selector, the Goblet of Fire." Dumbledore now took out his wand and tapped 3 times upon the top of the casket. The lid croaked open. Dumbledore reached inside and pulled out a large, roughly hewn wooden cup. It would have been entirely unremarkable had it not been full to the brim with dancing blue-white flames. Dumbledore closed the casket and placed the goblet carefully on top of it, where it would be clearly visible to everyone in the hall. Anybody wishing to submit themselves as a champion must write their name in school clearly upon a slip of parchment and drop it into the goblet, said Dumbledore. Aspiring champions have 24 hours in which to put their names forward. Tomorrow night, Halloween, the goblet will return the names of the 3 it has judged most worthy to represent their schools. The goblet will be placed in the entrance hall tonight, where it will be freely accessible to all those wishing to compete. To ensure that no underage student yields to temptation, said Dumbledore, I will be drawing an age line around the goblet of fire once it has been placed in the entrance hall. Nobody under the age of 17 will be able to cross this line. Finally, I wish to impress upon any of you wishing to compete that this tournament is not to be entered lightly. Once a champion has been selected by the Goblet of Fire, he or she is obligated to see the tournament through to the end. The placing of your name into the goblet constitutes a binding magical contract. There can be no change of heart once you have become a champion. Please be very sure, therefore, that you are wholeheartedly prepared to play before you drop your name into the goblet. Now, I think it is time for bed. Good night to you all. An age line, Fred Weasley said, his eyes glinting as they all made their way across the hall to the doors into the entrance hall. Well, that should be followed by an aging potion, shouldn't it? And once your name's in that goblet, you're laughing. It can't tell whether you're 17 or not. But I don't think anyone under 17 will stand a chance, said Hermione. We just haven't learned enough. Speak for yourself, said George shortly. You'll try and get in, won't you, Harry? Harry thought briefly of Dumbledore's insistence that nobody under 17 should submit their name, and then wonderful picture of himself winning the Triwizard Tournament filled his mind again. He wondered how angry Dumbledore would be if someone younger than 17 did find a way to get over the age line. Where is he? Said Ron, who wasn't listening to a word of this conversation, but looking through the crowd to see what had become of Krum. Dumbledore didn't say where Drumstring people were sleeping, did he? But this query was answered almost instantly. They were level with Slytherin table now, and Karkaroff had just bustled up to a student. Back to the ship then, he was saying. Victor, how are you feeling? Did you eat enough? Should I send for some mulled wine from the kitchens? Harry saw Krum shake his head and pulled his furs back on. Professor, I would like some wine, said one of the other Durmstrang's boys hopefully. I wasn't offering it to you, Polyakov, snapped Karkaroff, his warmly paternal air vanishing in an instant. I notice you have dribbled food all down the front of your robes again. Disgusting boy. Karkaroff turned and led his students toward the door, reaching them at exactly the same moment as Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Harry stopped to let him walk through first. Thank you, said Karkaroff carelessly, glancing at him. Then he froze, turned back his head to Harry, and stared at him as though he couldn't believe his eyes. Behind their headmaster, the students from Durmstrang came to a halt too. Karkaroff's eyes moved slowly up to Harry's face and fixed upon his scar. The Durmstrang students were staring curiously at Harry too. Out of the corner of his eye, Harry saw comprehension dawn on their faces. The boy with food all down his front nudged the girl next to him and pointed openly at Harry's forehead. Yeah, that's Harry Potter, said a growling voice from behind them. Professor Karkaroff spun around. Mad-Eye Moody was standing there, leaning heavily on his staff, his magical eye glaring unblinkingly at the Durmstrang headmaster. The color drained from Karkaroff's face as Harry watched. A terrible look of mingled fury and fear came over him. "You," he said, staring at Moody as though unsure he was really seeing him. "Me," said Moody grimly. "And unless you've got anything to say to Potter, Karkaroff, you might want to move. You're blocking the doorway." It was true. Half the students in the hall were now waiting behind them, looking over one another's shoulders to see what was causing the holdup. Without another word, Professor Karkaroff swept his students away with him. Moody watched him until he was out of sight, his magical eyes fixed upon his back, a look of intense dislike upon his mutilated face. As the next day was a Sunday, most students would normally have breakfast late. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were not alone in rising much earlier than they usually did on the weekends. When they went down to the entrance hall, they saw about 20 people milling around, some of them eating toast, and toast. I can't read this part. It had been placed in the entrance hall on a stool that normally bore the sorting hat. A thin golden line had been traced on the floor, forming a circle 10 feet around in every direction. "Anyone put their name in yet?" Ron asked the third-year girl eagerly. "All the Durmstrang lot," she replied, "but I haven't seen anyone from Hogwarts yet. Bet some of them put in their name last night after we all gone to bed. I would have if it had been me. Wouldn't have wanted everybody watching. What if the goblet just gobbed you right back out again?" Someone laughed behind Harry. Turning, he saw Fred, George, and Lee Jordan hurrying down the staircase. "Done it," Fred said in a triumphant whisper to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "Just take it." "What?" said Ron. "The aging potion, Dumbrains," said Fred. "1 drop each," said George, rubbing his hands together with glee. "We only need to be a few months older. We're going to split the 1,000 galleons between the 3 of us, if one of us wins," said Lee, grinning broadly. "I'm not sure this is going to work, you know," said Hermione warningly. "I'm sure Dumbledore will have thought of this." Fred, George, and Lee ignored her. "Ready?" Fred said to the other two, quivering with excitement. "Come on then, I'll go first." Harry watched, fascinated, as Fred pulled a slip of parchment out of his pocket bearing the words, "Fred Weasley, Hogwarts." Fred walked right up to the edge of the line and stood there, rocking on his toes like a diver, preparing for a 50-foot diver, preparing for a 50-foot drop. Then, with the eyes of every person in the entrance hall upon him, he took a great breath and stepped over the line. For a split second, Harry thought it had worked. George certainly thought so, for he let out a yell of triumph and leapt after Fred. But next moment there was a loud sizzling sound, and both twins were hurled out of the golden circle, as though they had been thrown by an invisible shot putter. They landed painfully 10 feet away on the stone-cold floor, and to add insult to injury, there was a loud popping noise, and both of them sported identical long, wide beards. "I did warn you," said a deep, amused voice, and everyone turned to see Professor Dumbledore coming out of the great hall. He surveyed Fred and George, his eyes twinkling. "I suggest you both go to Madame Pomfrey. She's always tending to Miss Fawcett of Ravenclaw and Mr. Summers of Hufflepuff," both of whom decided to age themselves up a little too, though I must say, neither of their beards is anything like as fine as yours. Fred and George set off to the hospital wing, accompanied by Lee, who was howling with laughter. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, also trailing, went in to breakfast. The decorations in the Great Hall had changed this morning. As it was Halloween, a cloud of live bats was fluttering around the enchanted ceiling, while hundreds of carved pumpkins leered from every corner. Harry led the way over to Dean and Seamus, who were discussing those Hogwarts students of 17 or over who might be entering. There's a rumor going around that Warrington got up early and put his name in, Dean told Harry. That big bloke from Slytherin who looks like a sloth. Harry, who had played Quidditch against Warrington, shook his head in disgust. We can't have a Slytherin champion. And all the Hufflepuffs are talking about Diggory, said Seamus contemptuously. But I wouldn't have thought he wanted to risk his good looks. Listen, said Hermione suddenly. People were cheering out in the entrance hall. They all swiveled around in their seats and saw Angelina Johnson coming into the hall, grinning in an embarrassed sort of way. A tall black girl who played chaser in the Gryffindor Quidditch team. Angelina came over to them, sat down, and said, Well, I've done it. Just put my name in. You're kidding, said Ron, looking impressed. Are you 17 then? asked Harry. Of course she is. Can't see a beard, can you? Said Ron. I had my birthday last week, said Angelina. Well, I'm glad someone from Gryffindor is entering, said Hermione. I really hope you get it, Angelina. Thanks, Hermione, said Angelina, smiling at her. Yeah, better you than pretty boy Diggory, said Seamus, causing several Hufflepuffs passing their table to scowl heavily at him. What are we going to do today, then? Ron asked Harry and Hermione when they had finished breakfast and were leaving the Great Hall. We haven't been down to visit Hagrid yet, said Harry. Okay, said Ron, just as long as he doesn't ask to donate 5 fingers to Scrooge. A look of great excitement suddenly dawned on Hermione's face. I've just realized I haven't asked Hagrid to join Spew yet, she said brightly. Wait for me, will you, while I nip upstairs and get his badges. What is it with her? Said Ron, exasperated, as Hermione ran away up the marble staircase. Hey, Ron, said Harry suddenly, it's your friend. The students from Beauxbatons were coming through the front doors from the grounds, among them the Violet girl. Those gathered around the goblet fire stood back and let them pass, watching eagerly. Madame Maxine entered the hall behind her students and organized them into a line. One by one, the Beauxbatons students stepped across the H line and dropped their slips of parchment into the blue-white flames. As each name entered the fire, it turned briefly red and emitted the sparks. What do you reckon will happen to the ones who aren't chosen? Ron muttered to Harry. Reckon they'll go back to school or hang around to watch the tournament. Dunno, said Harry. Hang around, I suppose. Madame Maxine staying to judge, isn't she? When all the Beauxbatons students had submitted their names, Madame Maxine led them back out of the hall and onto the grounds again. Where are they sleeping then? A loud rattling noise behind them announced Hermione's appearance with a box of Spew badges. Oh, good, hurry up, said Ron, and he jumped down the stone steps, keeping his eyes on the back of the Violet girl, who was now halfway across the lawn with Madame Maxine. As they reached Hagrid's cabin on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, the mystery of the Beauxbatons sleeping quarters was solved. The gigantic powder blue carriage, which they had arrived in, had been parked 200 yards from Hagrid's front door, and the students were climbing back inside. The elephantine flying horses that had pulled the carriage were now grazing in a makeshift paddock alongside it. Harry knocked on Hagrid's door, and Fang's booming barks answered instantly. About time, said Hagrid when he flung the door open. Thought you'd forgotten where I live. You've been really busy, Hagrid, Hermione started to say, but then she stopped dead, looking up at Hagrid, apparently lost for words. Hagrid was wearing his best and very horrible hairy brown suit, plus a checked yellow and orange tie. This wasn't the worst of it, though. He had evidently tried to tame his hair, using large quantities of what appeared to be axle grease. It was now slicked down into two bunches. Perhaps he tried a ponytail, like Bill's, but found it had too much hair. The look didn't really suit Hagrid at all. For a moment, Hermione goggled at him. Then, obviously deciding not to comment, she said, where are the screws? Out by the pumpkin patch, said Hagrid happily. They're getting massive. Must be nearly 3 foot long now. Only trouble is they've started killing each other. Oh no, really? Said Hermione, shooting a repressive look at Ron, who, staring at Hagrid's odd hairstyle, had just opened his mouth to say something about it. Yeah, said Hagrid sadly. It's okay though. I've got them in separate boxes now. Still got about 20. Well, that's lucky, said Ron. Hagrid missed the shy cabin. Hagrid's cabin comprised a single room, in one corner of which a gigantic bed covered a patchwork quilt. Similarly, enormous wooden table and chairs stood in front of the fire beneath the quantity of cured hams and dead birds hanging from the ceiling. They sat down at the table with Hagrid, while Hagrid started to make tea, and were soon immersed in yet more discussion of the Triwizard Tournament. You wait, said Hagrid, grinning. You just wait. You're going to see some stuff you've never seen before. First task. Although I'm not supposed to say. Go on, Hagrid, Harry, Ron, and Hermione urged him, but he shook his head, grinning. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's going to be spectacular. I'll tell you that. The champions are going to have to work cut out. Never thought I'd ever see the Triwizard Tournament played again. They ended up having lunch with Hagrid, though they didn't eat much. Hagrid had made what he said was beef casserole, but after Hermione unearthed a large talon in hers, she, Harry, and Ron had rather lost their appetite. However, they enjoyed themselves trying to make Hagrid tell them what tasks in the tournament were going to be, speculating which of the entrants were likely to be selected as champion, and wondering whether Fred and George were beardless yet. A light rain had started to fall by mid-afternoon. It was very cozy, sitting by the fire, listening to the gentle patter of the drops in the window, watching Hagrid darning his socks and arguing with Hermione about house elves. He flatly refused to join Spew when she showed him her patches. I'd be doing them unkindness, Hermione, he said gravely, threading a massive bone needle with a thick yellow yarn. It's in their nature to look after humans. That's what they like, see? You'd be making them unhappy to take away their work, and insulting them if you tried to pay them. But Harry said Dobby free, and he was over the moon about it, said Hermione. And we heard he's asking for wages now. Yeah, well, you got weirdos in every breed. I'm not saying there isn't the odd elf who'd take freedom, but you'll never persuade most of them to do it. No, I'm not doing it, Hermione. Hermione looked very cross indeed and stuffed her box of badges back into her cloak pocket. By 5:30, it was growing dark. Ron and Harry and Hermione decided it was time to get back up to the castle for the Halloween feast, and more important, the announcement of the school champions. I'll come with you, said Hagrid, putting away his darning. Just give us a second. Hagrid got up, went across to the chest of drawers beside his bed, and began searching something inside it. They didn't pay too much attention until the horrible smell reached their nostrils. Coughing, Ron said, Hagrid, what is that? Hagrid turned around with the large bottle in his hand. Don't you like it? Is that aftershave? Said Hermione in a slightly choked voice. Eau de Cologne, Hagrid muttered. He was blushing. Maybe it's a bit much, he said gruffly. I'll take it off, hang on. He stumped out of the cabin. They saw him washing himself vigorously in a water barrel outside the window. What's with the hair in the suit? Said Harry in an undertone. Look, said Ron suddenly, pointing out the window. Hagrid had just straightened up and turned around. If he'd been blushing before, it was nothing to what he was doing now. Getting to their feet very cautiously, so that Hagrid wouldn't spot them, Harry, Ron, and Hermione peered through the window and saw that Madame Maxime and the Beauxbaton students had just emerged from their carriage, clearly about to set off for the feast too. They couldn't hear what Hagrid was saying, but he was talking to Madame Maxime with a rapt, misty-eyed expression Harry had only seen him wear once before, when he had been looking at the baby dragon Norbert. He's going up to the castle with her, said Hermione indignantly. I thought he was waiting for us. Without so much as a backward glance at his cabin, Hagrid was trudging up off the grounds with Madame Maxime, the Beauxbaton students following in their wake, jogging to keep up with their enormous strides. You fancy, sir, said Ron incredulously. Well, if they end up having children, they'll be setting a world record. Bet any baby of theirs will weigh about a ton. They let themselves out of the cabin and shut the door behind them. It was surprisingly dark outside. Drawing their cloaks more closely around themselves, they had set off up the sloping lawns. Oh, it's them, look, Hermione whispered. The Durmstrang party was walking up toward the castle from the lake. Victor Crumb was walking side by side with Karkaroff, and the other Durmstrang students were straggling along behind them. Ron watched Crumb excitedly, but Crumb did not look around as he reached the front doors a little ahead of Hermione. Hermione, Ron, and Harry, and proceeded through them. When they entered the candlelit great hall, it was almost full. The goblet of fire had been moved. It was now standing in front of Dumbledore's empty chair at the teacher's table. Fred and George, clean-shaven again, seemed to have taken their disappointment fairly well. Hope it's Angelina, said Fred as George, Ron, and Hermione sat down. So do I, said Hermione breathlessly. Well, we'll see soon. The Halloween feast seemed to take much longer than usual, perhaps because it was their second feast in 2 days. Harry didn't seem to fancy the extravagantly prepared food as much as he would have normally. Like everyone else in the hall, judging by the constantly craning necks, the impatient expressions on every face, the fidgeting, and the standing up to see whether Dumbledore had finished eating yet, Harry simply wanted the plates to clear, and to hear who had been selected as champions. At long last, the golden plates returned to their original spotless state. There was a sharp upswing in the level of noise within the hall, which died away almost instantly as Dumbledore got to his feet. On either side of him, Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxime looked tense and expectant as anyone. Ludo Bagman was beaming and winking at various students. Mr. Crouch, however, looked quite uninterested, almost bored. Well, the goblet is almost ready to make its decision, said Dumbledore. I estimate that it requires 1 more minute. Now when the champions' names are called, I would ask them to please come up to the top of the hall, walk along the staff table, and go through into the next chamber. He indicated the door behind the staff table, where they will be receiving their first instructions. He took out his wand. He took out his wand and gave a great sweeping wave with it. At once, all the candles except those inside the carved pumpkins were extinguished, plunging them into a state of semi-darkness. The goblet of fire now shone more brightly than anything in the whole hall. The sparkling, bright, bluey whiteness of the flames was almost painful on the eyes. Everyone watched, waiting. A few people kept checking their watches. "Any second," Lee Jordan whispered, 2 seats away from Harry. The flames inside the goblet suddenly turned red again. Sparks began to fly from it. Next moment, a tongue of flame shot into the air. A shared piece of paper parchment. "Whoa, I'm stroking him," fluttered out of it. The whole room gasped. Dumbledore caught the piece of parchment and held it at arm's length, so that he could read it by the light of the flames, which had turned back to blue-white. "The champion for Durmstrang," he said in a strong, clear voice, "will be Victor Crumb." "No surprises there," yelled Ron as the storm of applause and cheering swept the hall. Harry saw Victor Crumb rise from the Slytherin table and slouch up toward Dumbledore. He turned right, walked along the staff table, and disappeared through the door into the chamber. "Bravo, Victor," boomed Gandalf. Why did I say it like that? So loudly that everyone could hear him, even over all the applause. "Knew you had it in you." The clapping and chatting died down. Now everyone's attention was focused again on the goblet, which second later turned red once more. A second piece of parchment shot out of it, propelled by the flames. "The champion for Beauxbatons," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur Delacour." "It's her, Ron," Harry shouted as the girl who so resembled Ophelia got gracefully to her feet, shook back her sheet of silvery blonde hair, and swept up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. "Oh, they're all disappointed," said Hermione over the noise, nodding toward the remainder of the Beauxbaton party. Disappointed was a bit of an understatement, Harry thought. 2 of the girls who had not been selected had dissolved into tears and were sobbing with their hands in the arms. When Fleur Delacour too had vanished into the side of the chamber, silence fell again, but this time it was a silence so stiff with excitement you could almost taste it. The Hogwarts champion next, and the goblet of fire turned red once more. Sparks showed out of it. The tongue of flames shot high into the air, and from its tip Dumbledore pulled the third piece of parchment. "The Hogwarts champion," he called, "is Cedric Diggory." "No," said Ron loudly, but nobody heard him except Harry, and the uproar from the next table was too great. Every single Hufflepuff had jumped to his or her feet, screaming and stamping as Cedric made his way past them, grinning broadly, and headed off toward the chamber behind the teacher's table. Indeed, the applause for Cedric went on so long that it was some time before Dumbledore could make himself heard again. "Excellent," Dumbledore called happily, as at last the remote died down. "Well, we now have our 3 champions. I am sure I can count upon all of you, including the remaining students from Beauxbatons and Durmstrang, to give your champions every ounce of support you can muster. By cheering your champion on, you will contribute in a very real—" But Dumbledore suddenly stopped speaking, and it was apparent to everybody what had distracted him. The fire in the goblet had just turned red again. Sparks were flying out of it. A long flame shot suddenly into the air, and upon it was another piece of parchment. Automatically, it seemed, Dumbledore reached out a long hand and seized the parchment. He held it out and stared at the name written upon it. There was a long pause, during which Dumbledore stared at the slip in his hands. Everyone in the room stared at Dumbledore. Then Dumbledore cleared his throat and read out, Harry Potter. Chapter 17. The Four Champions. Harry sat there, aware that every head in the Great Hall had turned to look at him. He was stunned. He felt numb. He was surely dreaming. He had not heard correctly. There was no applause. A buzzing as though of angry bees was starting to fill the hall. Some students were standing up to get a better look at Harry as he sat, frozen in his seat. Up at the top table, Professor McGonagall had got to her feet and swept past Ludo Bagman and Professor Karkaroff to whisper urgently to Professor Dumbledore, who bent his ear toward her, frowning slightly. Harry turned to Ron and Hermione beyond them. He saw the long Gryffindor table all watching him, open-mouthed. "I didn't put my name in," Harry said blankly. "You know I didn't." Both of them just stared blankly back. At the top table, Professor Dumbledore had straightened up, nodding to Professor McGonagall. "Harry Potter," he called again. "Harry up here, if you please." "Go on," Hermione whispered, giving Harry a slight push. Harry got to his feet, trod on the hem of his robes, and stumbled slightly. He set off up the gap between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. It felt like an immensely long walk. The top table didn't seem to be getting any nearer at all, and he could feel hundreds and hundreds of eyes upon him, as though each were a searchlight. The buzzing grew louder and louder. After what seemed like an hour, he was right in front of Dumbledore, feeling the stares of all his teachers upon him. "Well, through the door, Harry," said Dumbledore. He wasn't smiling. Harry moved off along the teacher's table. Hagrid was seated right at the end. He did not wink at Harry, or wave, or give any of his usual signs of greeting. He looked completely astonished and stared at Harry as he passed like everyone else. Harry went through the door and out of the Great Hall and found himself in a smaller room, lined with paintings of witches and wizards. A handsome fire was roaring in the fireplace opposite him. The faces in the portraits turned to look at him as he entered. He saw a witch flit out of frame of her picture and into the next one, which contained a wizard with a walrus mustache. The witch started whispering in his ear. Victor Crumb, Cedric Diggory, and Fleur Delacour were grouped around the fire. They looked strangely impressive, silhouetted against the flames. Crumb, hunched up and brooding, was leaning against the mantelpiece, slightly apart from the other two. Cedric was standing with his hand behind his back, staring into the flame. Fleur Delacour looked around when Harry walked in. "What is it?" she said. "Do they want us back in the hall?" She thought he had come to deliver a message. Harry didn't know how to explain what just happened. He just stood there, looking at the three champions. It struck him how very tall all of them were. There was a sound of scurrying feet behind him, and Ludo Bagman entered the room. "Extraordinary," he muttered, squeezing Harry's arm. "Absolutely extraordinary. Gentlemen, lady," he added, "may I introduce, incredible though it may seem, the fourth Triwizard Champion." Victor Crumb straightened up, his surly face darkened as he surveyed Harry. Cedric looked nonplussed. He looked from Bagman to Harry, and back again, as though he must have misheard what Bagman said. Fleur Delacour, however, tossed her hair smiling and said, "Oh, a very funny joke, Mr. Bagman." "Joke?" Bagman repeated, bewildered. No, not at all. Harry's name just came out of the goblet of fire." "But evidently there's been a mistake," she said contemptuously to Bagman. "You cannot compete, it is too young." "Well, it is amazing," said Bagman, rubbing his smooth chin and smiling down at Harry. "But as you know, the age restriction was only imposed this year as an extra safety measure. And as his name has come out of the goblet, I don't think there can be any ducking out at this stage. It's down in the rules. You're obligated to. Harry will just have to do the best he. The door opened behind them again, and a large group of people came in. Professor Dumbledore, followed closely by Mr. Crouch, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Snape. Harry heard buzzing of hundreds of students on the other side of the wall. Professor McGonagall closed the door. Madame Maxime, said Fleur at once, striding over to her headmistress. They are saying that this little boy is to compete also. Somewhere under Harry's numb disbelief, he felt a ripple of anger. Little boy. Madame Maxime had drawn herself up to her full and considerable height. The top of her handsome head brushed the candle-filled chandelier, and her gigantic black satin bosom swelled. "What is the meaning of this, Dumbledore?" she said imperiously. "I'd rather like to know that myself, Dumbledore," said Professor Karkaroff. He was wearing a steely smile, and his blue eyes were like chips of ice. 2 Hogwarts champions. I don't remember anyone telling me the school is allowed 2 champions. Or have I not read the rules carefully enough? He gave a short and nasty laugh. "C'est impossible," said Madame Maxime, whose enormous hand with its many superb opals was resting upon Fleur's shoulder. "Hogwarts cannot have 2 champions. It is most unjust. We were under the impression that your age line would keep out younger contestants, Dumbledore," said Karkaroff, his steely smile still in place, though his eyes colder than ever. "Otherwise, we would of course have brought along a wider selection of candidates from our own schools." "It's no one's fault but Potter's, Karkaroff," said Snape softly. His black eyes were alight with malice. "Don't go blaming Dumbledore for Potter's determination to break rules. He has been crossing lines ever since he arrived here." "Thank you, Severus," said Dumbledore firmly, and Snape went quiet, though his eyes glinted malevolently. You did not hear that? Through his curtain of greasy black hair. Professor Dumbledore was now looking down at Harry, who looked right back at him, trying to discern the expression of the eye behind the half-moon spectacles. "Did you put your name into the goblet of fire, Harry?" he asked calmly. "No," said Harry. He was very aware of everybody watching him closely. Snape made a soft noise of impatient disbelief in the shadows. "Did you ask any older student to put into the goblet of fire for you?" said Dumbledore, ignoring Snape. "No," said Harry. "But of course he is lying," cried Madame Maxime. Snape was now shaking his head, his lip curling. "He could not have crossed the age line," Professor McGonagall said sharply. "I'm sure we all agree on that." "Dumbledore must have made a mistake with the line," said Madame Maxime, shrugging. It is possible, of course," said Dumbledore politely. "Dumbledore, you know perfectly well you did not make a mistake," said Professor McGonagall angrily. "Really, what nonsense. Harry could not have crossed the line himself, and as Professor Dumbledore believes he did not persuade any older students to do it for him, I'm sure that should be good enough for everybody else." She shot a very angry look at Professor Snape. "Mr. Crouch, Mr. Bagman," said Karkaroff, his voice to whatever. "Once more, you are our objective judges. Surely you will agree that this is most irregular." Bagman wiped his round, boyish face with his handkerchief and looked at Mr. Crouch, who was standing outside the circle of firelight, his face half hidden in the shadow. It looked slightly eerie, the half-darkness making him look much older, giving him an almost skull-like appearance. When he spoke, however, it was in his usual curt voice. "We must follow the rules. State clearly that those people whose names come out of the goblet of fire are bound to compete in the tournament." "Well, Bartine," knows the rules of the book back to front, said Bagman, beaming, and turned back to Karkaroff and Madame Maxime, as though the matter was now closed. I insist upon resubmitting the names and the rest of my students, said Karkaroff. He had dropped his unctuous tone and his smile now. His face wore a very ugly look indeed. We will set up the goblet of fire once more, and we will continue adding names until the school has 2 champions. It's only fair, Dumbledore. Karkaroff, it doesn't work like that, said Bagman. The goblet of fire has just gone out. It won't reunite until the start of next tournament, in which Durmstrang will most certainly not be competing, exploded Karkaroff. After all our meetings and negotiation and compromises, I little expected something of this nature to occur. I have half a mind to leave now. Empty threat, Karkaroff, growled a voice from near the door. You can't leave your champion now. He's got to compete. They've all got to compete. Binding magical contract, like Dumbledore said. Convenient, eh? Moody had just entered the room. He limped toward the fire. With every right step he took, there was a loud clunk. Convenient, said Karkaroff. I'm afraid I don't understand you, Moody. Harry could tell he was trying to sound disdainful, as though what Moody was saying was barely worth his notice, but his hands gave him away. They balled themselves into fists. Don't you? Said Moody quietly. It's very simple, Karkaroff. Someone put Potter's name into that goblet, knowing he'd have to compete if it came out. Evidently someone who wished to give Hogwarts 2 bites at the apple, said Madame Maxime. I quite disagree, Madame Maxime, said Karkaroff, bowing to her. I shall be lodging complaints with the Ministry of Magic and the Internal Confederation of Wizards. If anyone's got a reason to complain, it's Potter, growled Moody. But funny thing, I don't hear him saying a word. Why should he complain? Burst out Fleur Delacour, stamping her foot. He has a chance to compete, hasn't he? We have all been hoping to be chosen for weeks and weeks. The honor of our schools, 1,000 galleons in prize money. This chance many would die for. Maybe someone's hoping Potter is going to die for it, said Moody, with the merest trace of growl. An extremely tense silence followed these words. Ludo Bagman, who was looking very anxious indeed, bounced nervously up and down on his feet, and said, Moody, old man, what a thing to say. We all know Professor Moody considers the morning wasted if he hadn't discovered 6 plot of murder before his lunchtime, said Karkaroff loudly. Apparently he is now teaching his students to fear assassination too. An odd quality in defense against the dark arts, teacher, Dumbledore, but no doubt you had your reasons. Imagining things, am I? Growled Moody. Seeing things, It was a skilled witch or wizard who put that boy's name into the goblet. And what evidence is there of that? Said Madame Maxime, throwing up her huge hands. Because they hoodwinked a very powerful magical object, said Moody. It would have needed an exceptionally strong convinced charm to bamboozle that goblet into forgetting that only 3 schools compete the tournament. I'm guessing they submitted Potter's name under the 4th school to make sure he was the only one in his category. You seem to have given this a great deal of thought, Moody, said Karkaroff coldly, and a very ingenious theory it is, though of course, I heard you recently got into your head that one of your birthday presents contained a cunningly disguised basilisk egg and smashed it to pieces before realizing it was a carriage clock. So you'll understand if we don't take you entirely seriously. There are those who will turn innocent occasions into advantage, Moody retorted in a menacing voice. My job is to think the way dark wizards do, Karkaroff, as you ought to remember. Alistair, said Dumbledore warningly. Harry wondered for a moment whom he was speaking to, and then he realized Mad-Eye could hardly be Moody's first real name. Moody fell silent, as though still surveying Karkaroff with satisfaction. Karkaroff's face was burning. How the situation arose, we do not know, said Dumbledore, speaking to everyone gathered in the room. It seems to me, however, that we have no choice but to accept it. Both Cedric and Harry have been chosen to compete in the tournament. This, therefore, they will do. But Dumbledore, my dear Madame Maxime, if you have an alternative, I would be delighted to hear it. Dumbledore waited, but Madame Maxime did not speak. She merely glared. She wasn't the only one either. Snape looked furious. Karkaroff livid. Bagman, however, looked rather excited. Well, shall we crack on then? He said, rubbing his hands together and smiling around the room. Got to give our champion their instructions, haven't we? Barty. Want to do the honors? Mr. Crouch seemed to come out of a deep reverie. Yes, he said. Instructions, yes. The first task. He moved forward into the firelight. Close up. Harry thought he looked ill. There were dark shadows behind his eyes. And had this papery look about his wrinkled skin that had not been there at the Quidditch World Cup. The first task is designed to test your daring, he told Harry, Cedric, Fleur, and Victor. So we are not going to be telling you what it is. Courage in the face of the unknown is an important quality in a wizard. Very important. The first task will place on November the 24th, in front of the other students and the panel of judges. The champions are not permitted to ask for or accept help of any kind from their teachers to complete tasks in the tournament. The champions will face the first challenge armed only with their wand. They will receive information about the second task when the first is over. Owing to the demanding and time-consuming nature of the tournament, the champions are exempted from end-of-year tests. Mr. Crouch turned to look at Dumbledore. I think that's all it is, Albus. I think so, said Dumbledore, who was looking at Mr. Crouch with mild concern. Are you sure you wouldn't like to stay at Hogwarts tonight, Barty? No, Dumbledore, I have to get back to the ministry, said Mr. Crouch. It is a very busy, very difficult time at the moment. I've left young Weatherby in charge, very enthusiastic, a little over-enthusiastic, if the truth be told. You'll come and have a drink before you go, at least, said Dumbledore. Come on, Barty, I'm staying, said Bagman. It's all happening at Hogwarts now, you know, much more exciting than the office. I think not, Ludo, said Mr. Crouch, with a touch of his old impatience. Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, a nightcap, said Dumbledore. But Madame Maxime had already put her arm around Fleur's shoulders and was leading her swiftly out of the room. Harry could hear them both talking very fast in French as they went into the great hall. Karkaroff beckoned to Crump, and they too exited though in silence. Cedric, I suggest you go to bed, said Dumbledore, smiling at both of them. I'm sure Gryffindor and Hufflepuff are waiting to celebrate with you, and it would be a shame to deprive them of this excellent excuse to make a great deal of mess and noise. Harry glanced at Cedric, who nodded, and they left together. So, said Cedric with a slight smile, we're playing against each other again. I suppose, said Harry. He really couldn't think of anything to say. So tell me, said Hedrick as they reached the entrance hall, which was now lit only by torches in the absence of the goblet of fire. How did you get your name in? I didn't, said Harry, staring up at him. I didn't put it in. I was telling the truth. Okay, said Cedric. Harry could tell Cedric didn't believe him. Well, see you then. Instead of going up the marble staircase, Cedric headed for a door to his right. Harry stood listening to him going down the stone steps beyond it, and then slowly he started to climb the marble steps. Was anyone except Ron and Hermione going to believe him, or would they all think he'd put himself in for the tournament? Yeah, how could anyone think that? When he was facing competitors who'd 3 years more magical education than he had. When he was facing tasks that not only sounded very dangerous, but which he were to be performed in front of hundreds of people. Yes, he thought about it, fantasized about it, but it had been a joke, really, an idle sort of dream. He never really seriously considered entering. But someone else had considered it. Someone else who wanted him in the tournament and made sure he was entered. Why? To give him a 3? I didn't think so. To see him make a fool of himself? Well, they were likely to get their wish. But to get him killed? Was Moody just being his usual paranoid self? Couldn't someone have just put Harry's name into the goblet as a trick? A practical joke? Did anyone really want him dead? Harry was able to answer that at once. Yes, someone wanted him dead. Someone had wanted him dead ever since he had been a year old. Lord Voldemort. How could Voldemort have ensured that Harry's name got into the goblet of fire? Voldemort was supposed to be far away, in some distant country, in hiding, alone, feeble and powerless. Yet in that dream he had, just before he'd woken, with his scar hurting, Voldemort hadn't been alone. He'd been talking to Wormtail, plotting Harry's murder. Harry got a shock to find himself facing the fat lady already. He had barely noticed where his feet were carrying him. It was almost a surprise to see she was not alone in her fun. The wizard witch who had fluttered into her neighbor's painting, had joined the champions downstairs, was now sitting smugly beside the fat lady. Well, well, well. Violet just told me everything. Who's just been chosen as a school champion then? Balderdash, said Harry, jelling. It most certainly isn't, said the pale witch, indignantly. No, fee, it's the password, said the fat lady, soothingly, and swung forward on her hinges to let Harry into the common room. The blast of noise that met Harry's ear when the portrait opened almost knocked him backward. Next thing he knew, he was being wrenched inside the common room by about a dozen pair of hands. You should have told us you'd entered, bellowed Fred. He looked half annoyed, half impressed. How did you do it without getting a beard? Brilliant, said George. I didn't, Harry said. I don't know how. But Angelina had now swooped down upon him. Well, if it couldn't be me, at least it's a Gryffindor. You'll be able to pay back Diggory for that last Quidditch match, Harry, shrieked Katie Bell, another of the Gryffindor chasers. We've got food, Harry. Come and have some. I'm not hungry. I had enough at the feast. But nobody wanted to hear that he wasn't hungry. Nobody wanted to hear that he hadn't put in his name into the goblet. Not one single person seemed to have noticed that he wasn't at all in the mood to celebrate. Lee Jordan had unearthed it as a Gryffindor banner from somewhere, and he insisted on draping it around Harry like a cloak. Harry couldn't get away. Whenever he tried to slide to the staircase to the dormitory, the crowd around him closed ranks, forcing another butterbeer on him, stuffing crisps and peanuts into his hand. Everyone wanted to know how he'd done it, how he had tricked Dumbledore's age line and managed to get his name into the goblet. I did it, he said over and over again. I don't know how it happened. But for all the notice anyone took, he might just as well not have answered at all. I'm tired, he bellowed finally, after nearly half an hour. No, seriously, George, I'm going to bed. He wanted more than anything to find Ron and Hermione, to find a bit of sanity. Neither of them seemed to be in the common room, insisting that he needed to sleep, and almost flattening the little Creevy brothers, as they attempted to waylay him at the foot of the stairs. Harry managed to shake everyone off and climb up to the dormitory as fast as he could. To his great relief, he found Ron was lying in his bed in the otherwise empty dormitory, still fully dressed. He looked up when Harry slammed the door. Where have you been? Harry said. Oh, hello, said Ron. He was grinning, but it was a very odd, strange sort of grin. So, he said when Harry had finally removed the banner and thrown it into a corner. Congratulations. What do you mean, congratulations? Said Harry, staring at Ron. There was definitely something wrong with the way Ron was smiling. It was more like a grimace. Well, no one else got across the H line, said Ron. Not even Fred and George. What did you use? The invisibility cloak? The invisibility cloak wouldn't have got me over that line, said Harry slowly. Oh, right, said Ron. I think you might have told me if it was the cloak, because it would have covered both of us, wouldn't it? But you found another way, did you? Listen, I didn't put my name into that goblet. Someone else must have done it. What would they do that for? I don't know, said Harry. He felt it would sound very melodramatic. To kill me? Ron's eyebrows were so high that they were in danger of disappearing into his hair. It's okay, you can tell me the truth, he said. If you don't want anyone else to know, fine, but I don't know why you're bothering to lie. You didn't get in trouble for it, did you? That friend of the fat lady, that Violet, she's already told us all Dumbledore's letting you enter. 1,000 galleon pliers money, eh? And you don't have to do end of school year tests either. I didn't put my name in the goblet, said Harry, starting to feel angry. Yeah, okay, said Ron, in the exactly same skeptical tone as Cedric. You only said this morning that you'd have done it last night, and no one would have seen you. I'm not stupid, You're doing a really good impression of it, Harry snapped. Yeah, said Ron. There was no trace of grin, forced or otherwise, on his face now. If you want to go to bed, Harry, I expect you'll need to be up early in the morning for a photo call or something. He wrenched the hangings shut around his four-poster, leaving Harry standing there by the door, staring at the dark red velvet curtains, now hiding one of the few people he had been sure would believe him. Chapter 18. The Weighing of the Wands. When Harry woke up on Sunday morning, it took him a moment to remember why he felt so miserable and worried. Then, the memory of the previous night rolled over him. He sat up and ripped back the curtains of his own four-poster, intending to talk to Ron, to force Ron to believe him, only to find that Ron's bed was empty. He had obviously gone down to breakfast. Harry dressed and went down the spiral staircase into the common room. The moment he appeared, the people who already finished breakfast broke into applause again. The prospect of going into the great hall and facing the rest of Gryffindor, all treating him like some sort of hero, was not inviting. It was that, however, or stay here and allow himself to be cornered by the Creevy brothers, who were both beckoning frantically to him to join them. He walked resolutely over to the portrait hole, pushed it open, climbed out of it, and found himself face to face with Hermione. Hello, she said, holding up a stack of toast, which she was carrying on a napkin. I brought you this. Wanna go for a walk? Good idea, said Harry gratefully. They went downstairs, crossed the entrance hall quickly without even looking at the Great Hall, and were soon striding across the lawn toward the lake, where the Durmstrang ship was moored, reflected blackly on the water. It was a chilly morning, and they kept moving, munching on their toast, as Harry told Hermione exactly what had happened after he left the Gryffindor table the night before. Well, of course I knew you hadn't entered yourself. The look on your face when Dumbledore read out your name. But the question is, who did put you in? Because Moody's right, Harry. I don't think any student could have done it. They'd never be able to fool the goblet, or get over Dumbledore's. Have you seen Ron? Harry interrupted. Hermione hesitated. Yes, he was at breakfast. Does he still think I entered myself? No, I don't think so. Not really, said Hermione awkwardly. What's that supposed to mean, not really? Well, Harry, isn't it obvious? Hermione said despairingly. He's jealous. Jealous. Jealous of what? He wants to make a prat of himself in front of the whole school, does he? Look, said Hermione patiently. It's always you who gets all the attention. You know it is. I know it's not your fault, she added quickly, seeing Harry open his mouth furiously. I know you don't ask for it, but well, Ron's got all those brothers to compete against at home, and you're his best friend, and you're really famous. He's always shunted to one side whenever people see you, and he puts up with it. He never mentioned it, but I suppose this is just one too many. Great, he said bitterly. Really great. Tell him for me I'll swap anytime he wants. Tell him for me he's welcome to it. People gawping at my forehead everywhere I go. I'm not telling him anything, said Hermione shortly. Tell him yourself. It's the only way to sort this out. I'm not running around after him trying to make him grow up, said Harry, so loudly that several owls nearby tree took flight in alarm. Maybe he'll believe I'm not enjoying myself once I've got my neck broken, or that's not funny. That's not funny at all, said Hermione. She looked extremely anxious. Harry, I've been thinking. You know what we've got to do, don't you? Straight away, the moment we get back to the castle. Yeah, give Ron a good kick up the right to Sirius. You've got to tell him what's happened. He asked you to keep him posted on everything that's going on at Hogwarts. It's almost as if he's been expecting something like this to happen. I brought some parchment and a quill out with me. Come off it, said Harry, looking around to check that there couldn't be overheard. He'll probably come bursting right into the castle if I tell him someone's entered me into the tournament. He'd want you to tell him, Hermione said sternly. He's going to find out anyway. How? Harry, this isn't going to be kept quiet, said Hermione very seriously. This tournament's famous, and you're famous. I'll be really surprised if there isn't anything in the Daily Prophet about you competing. You're already in half the books about you-know-who, and Sirius would rather hear it from you. I know he would. Okay, I'll write to him. Said Harry, throwing his last piece of toast into the lake. They both stood and watched it floating there for a moment before a tentacle rose out of the water and scooped it beneath the surface. Then they returned to the castle. Whose owl am I going to use? Ask Ron if you can borrow. I'm not asking Ron for anything, Harry said flatly. Well, borrow one of the school owls. Anyone can use them. They went up to the owlery. Hermione gave Harry a piece of parchment, quill, and a bottle of ink, then strolled around the long lines of perches looking for all the different owls, while Harry sat down against the wall and wrote his letter. Dear Sirius, you told me to keep you posted on what's happening at Hogwarts, so here goes. I don't know if you've heard, but the Triwizard Tournament's happening this year, and on Saturday night, I got picked as the 4th champion. I don't know who put my name into the Goblet of Fire, because I didn't. The other Hogwarts champion is Cedric Diggory from Hufflepuff. He paused at this point, thinking. He had an urge to say something about the large weight of anxiety that seemed to have settled in his chest that night. But he couldn't think how to translate it into words, so he simply dipped his quill back into the ink and wrote, Hope you're okay, and Buckbeak. Harry. Finished, he told Hermione, getting to his feet and brushing straw off his robes. At this, Hedwig came fluttering down. I can't use you, Harry told her, looking around for school owls. I've got to use one of these. Hedwig gave a very loud hoot and took off so suddenly, her talons cut into his shoulder. She kept her back to Harry all the time he was tying his letter to the leg of a large barn owl. When the barn owl had flown off, Harry surged out to show Hedwig, but she clicked her beak furiously and soared up into the rafters, out of reach. First Ron and then you. This isn't my fault. If Harry had thought that matters would improve once everyone got used to the idea of him being a champion, the following day showed him how mistaken he was. He could no longer avoid the rest of the school once he was back at lessons, and it was clear that the rest of the school, just like Gryffindor's, thought Harry had entered himself in for the tournament. Unlike the Gryffindors, however, they did not seem impressed. The Hufflepuffs were usually on excellent terms with the Gryffindors, and had turned remarkably cold toward the whole lot of Gryffindors. One herbology lesson was enough to demonstrate this. It was plain that the Hufflepuffs felt that Harry had stolen their champion's glory, a feeling of exacerbated, perhaps, by the fact that Hufflepuff House rarely got any glory, and Cedric was one of the few who had ever given them any, having beaten Gryffindor once at Quidditch. Ernie Macmillan and Justin Finch Fletchley, with whom Harry normally got on very well, did not talk to him even though they were reporting bouncing bulbs at the same tray. Though they did laugh rather unpleasantly when one of the bouncing bulbs wriggled free from Harry's grip and smacked him hard in the face. Ron wasn't talking to Harry either. Hermione sat between them, making very forced conversation, but they both answered her nobly, avoiding making eye contact with each other. Harry thought even Professor Sprout seemed distant with him, but then she was head of Hufflepuff House. He would have been looking forward to seeing Hagrid under normal circumstances, but care of magical creatures meant seeing Slytherins too, the first time he would come face to face with them since becoming a champion. Predictably, Malfoy arrived at Hagrid's cabin with his familiar sneer firmly in place. "Look, boys, it's the champion," he said to Crabbe and Goyle, the moment he got within earshot of Harry. "Got your autograph books. Better get a signature because I doubt he's going to be around much longer. Half the Triwizard champions died. How long do you reckon you think you're going to last, Potter? 10 minutes? Into the first task is my bet." Crabbe and Goyle coughed psychopanically. I don't even know. But Malfoy had to stop there, because Hagrid emerged from the back of his cabin, balancing the teetering tower of crates, each containing a very large blast in its skirt. To the class's honor, Hagrid proceeded to explain that the reason the Scroots had been killing one another was an excess of pent-up energy, and that the solution would be for each student to fix a leash on a skirt and take it for a short walk. The only good thing about this plan was that it distracted Malfoy completely. "Take this thing for a walk," he repeated in disgust, staring into one of the boxes. "Where exactly are we supposed to fix the leash?" "Around this thing, a blasting end, or the sucker." "Round the middle," said Hagrid, demonstrating. You might want to put your dragonhide gloves on, just in case." "Harry, come here, and help me with this big one." Hagrid's real intention, however, was to talk to Harry away from the rest of class. "So you're competing, Harry, in the tournament, school champion." "One of the champions," Hagrid corrected him. Hagrid's beetle black eyes looked very anxious under his wild eyebrows. "No idea who put you in for it, Harry." "You believe I didn't do it, then?" said Harry, concealing with difficulty the rush of gratitude he felt at Hagrid's words. "Of course I do. You say it wasn't you, and I believe you. And Dumbledore believes you and all." "I wish I knew who did do it," said Harry bitterly. The pair of them looked over to the lawn. The class was widely scattered now, and all in great difficulty. The Scroots were now over 3 feet long and extremely powerful, no longer shellless and colorless. They had developed a kind of thick, grayish, shiny armor. They looked like a cross between giant scorpions and elongated crabs, but still without recognizable heads or eyes. They had become immensely strong and very hard to control. "Look like they're having fun, do they?" Hagrid said happily. Harry assumed he was talking about the Scroots, because the class certainly weren't. Every now and then, with an alarming bang, one of the screws would end up exploding, causing it to shoot forward several yards, and more than one person was being dragged along on their stomach. I don't know, Harry, Hagrid said suddenly. School champion, everything seems to happen to you, doesn't it? Harry didn't answer. Yes, everything did seem to happen to him. That was more or less what Hermione said as they had walked around the lake. And that was the reason, according to her, that Ron wasn't talking to him. The next few days were some of Harry's worst at Hogwarts. The closest he had ever come to feeling like this had been during those months in second year, when a large part of the school had suspected him of attacking his fellow students. But Ron had been on his side then. He thought he could have coped with the rest of the school's behavior if he could just have Ron back as a friend. But he wasn't going to try and persuade Ron to talk to him if Ron didn't want to. Nevertheless, it was lonely with dislike pouring in on him from all sides. He could understand the Hufflepuff's attitude, even if he didn't like it. They had their own champion to support. He expected nothing less than vicious insults from Slytherin. He was highly unpopular there, and had always been, because he had helped Gryffindor beat them so often, both at Quidditch and in the Inter-House Championship, that he hoped Ravenclaw might find it in their hearts to support him as much as Cedric. He was wrong, however. Most Ravenclaws seemed to think that he'd been desperate to earn himself a bit more fame by tricking the goblet into accepting his name. Then there was the fact that Cedric looked the part of the champion so much more than he did. Exceptionally handsome, with his straight nose, dark hair, and gray eyes. It was hard to say who was receiving more admiration these days, Cedric or Victor Crumb. Harry actually saw the same 6 years girls who had been so keen to get Crumb's autograph, begging Cedric to sign their school back on lunchtime. Meanwhile, there was no reply from Sirius. Hedwig was refusing to come anywhere near him. Professor Trelawney was predicting his death with even more certainty than usual, and he did so badly. At summoning charms in Professor Flitwick's class, he was giving extra homework, the only person that got any, apart from Neville. It's really not that difficult, Harry, Hermione tried to reassure him as they left Flitwick's class. She had been making objects zoom across the room to all listen as though she were some kind of weird magnet from board dusters, waste paper baskets, and lunoscopes. You just weren't concentrating properly. I wonder why that was, said Harry darkly as Cedric Diggory walked past, surrounded by a large group of simpering girls, all of whom looked at Harry as though he were a particularly large blast-ended screw. Still, never mind it. Double points to look forward to this afternoon. Oh, double potions. But double potions was always a horrible experience. But these days, it was nothing short of torture. Being shut in a dungeon for an hour and a half with Snape and the Slytherins, all of whom seemed determined to punish Harry as much as possible for daring to become school champion, was about the most unpleasant thing Harry could imagine. He had already struggled through one Friday's worth, with Hermione sitting next to him, intoning, "Ignore them, ignore them, ignore them," under her breath. Then, he couldn't see why today should be any better. Then, when he and Hermione arrived at Snape's dungeon for lunch, they found the Slytherins waiting outside. Each of them wore a large badge on the front of their robes. For one wild moment, Harry thought they were spew badges. Then, he saw that they all bore the same message, in luminous red letters that burned brightly in the dim-lit underground passage. Support Cedric Diggory, the real Hogwarts champion. Like them, Potter, said Malfoy, loudly as Harry approached. And this isn't all they do. Look. He He pressed his badge into his chest, and a message upon vanished, to be replaced by another one, which glowed green. Potter stinks. The Slytherins howled with laughter. Each of them pressed their badges until the message Potter stinks was shining brightly all around Harry. Harry felt heat rise in his face and neck. Very funny, Hermione said sarcastically to Pansy Parkinson and her gang of Slytherin girls, who were laughing harder than anyone. Really witty. Ron was standing against the wall with Dean and Seamus. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't sticking up for Harry either. Want one, Granger, said Malfoy, holding out badges to Hermione. I've got loads, but don't touch my hand now. I've just watched it, you see. Don't want a mudblood sliming it up. Some of the anger Harry had been feeling for days and days seemed to burst out through a dam in his chest. He reached for his wand and thought, before he thought what he was doing, people all around scrambled out of the way, backing down the corridor. Harry, Hermione said warningly. Go on then, Potter, Malfoy said quietly, drawing out his own wand. Moody's not here to look after you now. Do it if you've got the guts. For a split second, they looked at each other's eyes. Then, at exactly the same time, both acted. Some spell, Harry yelled. Oh my god, I can't believe this. Malfoy yelled something back. Jets of light shot from both wands, hit each other in midair, and ricocheted off at angles. Harry's hit Goyle in the face, and Malfoy's hit Hermione. Goyle bellowed and put his hands on his nose, where great, ugly boils were springing up. Hermione, whimpering in panic, was clutching her mouth. Hermione. Ron had hurried forward to see what was wrong with her. Harry turned and saw Ron dragging Hermione's hand from her face. It wasn't a pretty sight. Hermione's front teeth, already larger than average, were now growing at an alarming rate. She was looking more and more like a beaver, and her teeth elongated past her bottom lip. Toward her chin, panic-stricken, she felt them and let out a terrified cry. And what is all this noise about? Said a soft, dreadly voice. Snape arrived. The Slytherins clamored to give their explanations. Snape pointed a long yellow finger at Malfoy and explained. Potter attacked me, sir. We attacked each other at the same time. He hit Goyle. Look. Snape examined Goyle, whose face was resembled something that would have been at home in the book on poisonous fungi. Hospital wing, Goyle, Snape said calmly. Malfoy got Hermione, Ron said. Look. He forced Hermione to show Snape her teeth. She was doing her best to hide them with her hands, though this was difficult as they had grown past her collar. Pansy Parkinson and the other Slytherin girls were doubled up with silent giggles, pointing at Hermione from behind Snape's back. Snape looked coldly at Hermione and then said, I see no difference. Hermione let out a whimper. Her eyes filled with tears. She turned on her heel and ran all the way up the corridor and out of sight. It was lucky, perhaps, that both Harry and Ron started shouting at Snape at the same time. Luckily, their voices echoed so much in the stone corridor. For the confused din, it was impossible for him to hear exactly what they were calling him. He got the gist, however. Let's see, he said in the silkiest voice. 50 points from Gryffindor and a detention for Potter and Weasley. Now get inside, or it'll be a week worth of detentions. Harry's ears were ringing. The injustice of him made him want to curse Snape into 1,000 slimy pieces. He passed Snape, walked with Ron to the back of the dungeon, and then slammed his bag down on the table. Ron was shaking with anger too. For a moment, it felt as though everything was back to normal between them. but then Ron turned and sat down with Dean and Seamus instead, leaving Harry alone at his table. The other side of the dungeons, Malfoy turned his back on Snape and pressed his badge, smirking. Potter stinks flashed once more across the room. Harry sat there staring at Snape as the lesson began, picturing horrific things happening to him. If only he knew how to do the Cruciatus curse. He'd have Snape flat on his back like the spider, jerking and twitching. Antidotes, said Snape, looking around at them all, his cold black eyes glittering unpleasantly. You should all have prepared your recipes now. I want you to brew them carefully, and then we will be selecting someone on whom to test one. Snape's eyes had met Harry, and Harry knew what was coming. Snape was going to poison him. Harry imagined picking up his cauldron and sprinting to the front of the class, bringing it down on Snape's greasy head. Then a knock on the dungeon door burst in on Harry's thoughts. It was Colin Creevey. He edged into the room, beaming at Harry. Please, sir, I'm supposed to take Harry Potter upstairs. Snape stared down his hooked nose at Colin, whose smile faded from his eager face. Potter has another hour of potions to complete, said Snape coldly. He will come upstairs when class is finished. Sir, Mr. Bagman wants him, he said nervously. All the champions have got to go. I think they want to take photographs. Harry, who would have given everything he owned to have stopped Colin saying those last few words, each chance half glanced at Ron, but Ron was staring determinedly at the ceiling. Very well, Snape snapped. Potter, leave your things here. I want you back down here later to test your antidote. Please, sir, he's got to take his things with him. All the champions. Very well. Potter, take your bag and get out of my sight. Harry swung his bag over his shoulder, got up, and headed for the door. As he walked through the Slytherin's desk, Potter's things flashed at him from every direction. It's amazing, isn't it, Harry? Said Colin, starting to speak at the moment Harry closed the dungeon's door behind him. Isn't it, though? You being a champion. Yeah, really amazing, said Harry heavily as they set off toward the steps into the entrance hall. What do they want the photos for, Colin? The Daily Prophet, I think. Great, said Harry dully. Exactly what I need. More publicity. Good luck, said Colin when they reached the right room. Harry knocked on the door as he entered. It was a fairly small classroom. Most desks had been pushed away to the back of the room, leaving a large space in the middle. 3 of them, however, had been placed end to end in front of the blackboard and covered with a long length of velvet. 5 chairs had been set behind the velvet-covered desks, and Ludo Bagman was sitting in one of them, talking to a witch Harry had never seen before. Victor Crumb was standing moodily in a corner as usual, and not talking to anybody. Cedric and Fleur were in conversation. Fleur looked a great deal happier than Harry had seen her so far. She kept throwing her head back so that her long silvery hair caught the light. A paunchy man holding a large black camera that was smoking slightly was watching Fleur out of the corner of his eye. Bagman suddenly spotted Harry, got up quickly, and bounded forward. Here he is, champion number 4. In you come, Harry, in you come. Nothing to worry about, just the wand weighing ceremony. Wand weighing, Harry repeated nervously. We have to check that your wands are fully functional. No problems, you know, as they're your most important tools most important tools in the tasks ahead, said Bagman. The experts upstairs now with Dumbledore. Then there's going to be a little photo shoot. This is Rita Skeeter, he added, gesturing forward in magenta robes. My God. She's doing a small piece on the tournament for the Daily Prophet. Maybe not that small, Ludo, said Rita Skeeter, her eyes on Harry. I wonder if I could have a little word with Harry before we start, she said to Bagman. The youngest champion, you know, to add a bit of color. Certainly, cried Bagman. That's if Harry has no objection. Lovely, said Harry Skeeter. In a second, her scarlet-taloned fingers had Harry's upper arm in a surprisingly strong grip. We don't want to be in there with all that noise, she said. Yes, this is nice and cozy. It was a gloom cupboard. Harry stared at her.